Welcome to another museum moment, a series of talks hosted by Strauss and Company in which we showcase the wealth of art in public collections and unearth hidden gems such as the Legacy Museum we're talking about today. I'm Wilhelm van Rensburg, Senior Art Specialist at Strauss and Company, and I'm talking to Chantel Dartnall, the Director of the museum. Chantel, let's begin with the name of this wonderful museum. Whose legacy, which artist's legacy, and why?
So our family owns a group of companies that we established over 40 years ago. And what was important for us was to support not only South African artists, but also South African art. And the legacy is the legacy left behind of all of those artists, but also the vision that the directors of the company had to invest in something as beautiful as this.
Why a museum here in Elandsfontein, halfway between Pretoria-West and Hartbeespoort?
Well, my love for cooking sort of inspired the location. I am fanatical about botanical cuisine and being connected to nature. So when we established the restaurant here in the Franklin Conservancy, it was a natural progression to create a multi-sensory experience for our guests and to establish our museum here.
Okay. The very impressive museum building, part of the Orient Hotel. Tell us about the origins of that.
So this links up again with my great love for the Belle Époque. So we call the restaurant Mosaic, and if you go to Paris, you'll see the architecture of the Art Nouveau. Now, the origins of Art Nouveau was actually found in the old Orient, in Spain, with an architect by the name of Horta. And we went back to the Orient to discover this line. And this is how the Moorish architecture actually linked up with what we wanted to establish here. So it's all going back to the ancient art forms. Okay,
this area, of course, is well known for its fertile space of the space of inspiration for many other South African artists. We think of J.H. Pierneef, Alexis Preller, who lived in the area, the sculptors Dani de Jager and Tilly Pritchard, and of course in the 1980s it was also known as part of the Crocodile Ramble, with Bruce Atwood's printing shop just down the road and his wife at the time Judith Mason's studio here at Bruder Stewart. Tell us more about that aspect.
So I've actually been very fortunate, and my family, to be part of this Hartbeespoort Magalies Ramble. So a lot of the artists were artists that I grew up with. I spent time in their studios, cleaning paintbrushes and tidying up, trying to just absorb what was happening. Even artists like Gregoire Boonzaier were artists that, we interacted with personally, and both Tilly Pritchard and Adriaan Boshoff, I saw some of the creations from little sketches turning into absolute masterpieces.
What is also striking about the collection is the fact that the artworks have been creatively integrated in the whole space. You mentioned the restaurant earlier on, the bar, the reception areas, and the like. Tell us something more about that, how you went about decorating it.
Well, what was important for us is to truly create a multi-sensory experience. From the moment you enter the gate, we almost wanted our clients to escape, to forget about the hustle and bustle of the outside world and to totally just be, immersed in beauty. So it was important for us not to just have the museum where everything was formalized, but as you walk through the living spaces, to see this beautiful art displayed. And it almost gives you, a better connection as to what the diversity of the artists were.
I think another very important journey reflected in here is the manner in which you started the collection and the manner in which the collection developed. Now tell us where it started, what were included, what you collected, and perhaps some of the things that were highlights to you and some of the things that you missed out on, that you wished you had, and what you see the future to be.
I think something which people can see when they walk through the museum is that it's a very personal collection. We were almost involved in every single piece. So a lot of the work we bought directly from the artist because of our connection with them. And the very first painting was collected in 1978, when our mother company decided to invest in art. And from there, the collection grew exponentially. Even with Tini Pritchard, we started collecting his bronze sculptures. And that grew over the years, up until what you're able to discover and see today.
Now, the museum is also known for philanthropic endeavours in the art world. For example, you took the artist Lynn-Marie Eatwell to Mongolia. Tell us about that.
So for us, it's very important to support local talent. And I find something which happens is that as soon as young artists need to start surviving, they produce works on a more commercial level, and they're not painting what is within their soul. So with Lynn-Marie, we had a very special bond and a connection, and she was truly, inspired by the Mongolian, heritage and their ancestral techniques of using the eagle hunters. Even going to live with the Bushmen was something that she was fascinated of. And just by allowing her and giving her the means to be able to live with them, to support her, so that she could produce work that truly comes from her heart, is something which is truly, truly special for us.
Now, the bulk of the collection, of course, centers on Adriaan Boshoff, and I think one of the reasons that I can clearly see and that everybody can see is the connection between Adriaan Boshoff and the French impressionists. Tell us a little bit about that connection.
I wouldn't only say French impressionist. If you look at Sorolla, which is a masterful Spanish impressionist, the links between Adriaan Boshoff and Sorolla is incredible. And even Adriaan Boshoff studied some of Sorolla's works. Even if you look at John Singer Sargent, the use of light in the work is something which, once you walk through the museum, actually comes to light. But, the focus on painting outdoors, in capturing, the essence of life, is what Adriaan Boshoff truly displayed. And I think he got his inspiration from numerous artists.
One of my favourite works in the museum is this very small, unassuming little still life of the ex. And I think I like it because when you look closely at it, you can see almost a schoolboy doing his homework in the background. And also the ex in the front reminds me very much of the famous paintings that Alexis Prello did in his lifetime. What do you think of this?
Indeed, I have to say this was one of the very first paintings in our collection, and I grew up with this. I have to say this truly captures, a child coming home, doing his homework, and his eggs lying there, and it is just so symbolic. It's really beautiful.
And of course, this lovely still life with magnolias, and I'm reminded of the magnolia still lifes of Frans Uder at Irma Stern.
Indeed, and I have to say the use of copper in this work truly just brings the work to life.
So an early work by Adriaan Boshoff, and what to me stands out is the bit of blue that he put on the sides. It's absolutely phenomenal. Never seen anything like it.
It is indeed. And I have to say, I didn't quite recognize this as Adriaan Boshoff myself when I saw it.
This is, of course, a well-known subject matter and a very beloved theme that Adriaan Boshoff uses. The very dramatic cliff faces and the rocks. This is, of course, Mering's Poort.
This is beautiful. This is definitely one of those majestic pieces that people just get captured by.
And then, of course, his lovely high-felt landscapes. And again, here he is in tune with, earlier on I mentioned, Pieter, for instance, also very fond of depicting the high-felt.
Indeed, and you just see this calm, projecting from this painting.
My name's Alastair Meredith. The upstairs floor of the gallery includes a huge number of works focusing on gentle South African impressionism and post-impressionism. So think Hugo Naudé, Nita Spilhaus, Gregoire, Gwelo, Goodman, Cecil Higgs. The canon really of early 20th century South African painting. There are far too many pictures for me to talk about, even a small minority of them, but I have just selected a few of my personal highlights, starting off with this work on my left. It is by the fabulous Cecil Higgs, and it's a work called Leaves. It was exhibited at the Tate in London in 1948 and 1949 at a major exhibition of contemporary South African artists there. I love the journey it's made from the artist's studio in the Cape to Elandsfontein, 70 odd years later via the Tate in London. I love that kind of physical journey. The actual work seems to focus on a grouping of large leaves. Cecil Higgs's style is entirely unique. Yes, it has an overall impressionistic mode, but is always shot through with these ghostly electric colors. So look here at the yellows and greens and these shining grays in the background. It's an absolutely fabulous work, this, amongst a whole group of works by Cecil Higgs that sadly you can't see. They're off camera, but they are all around me. Higgs's work is generally, I think, very underappreciated. She was a major artist, training in London between 1920 and 1933, but building a career here in South Africa thereafter. Born in 1898. Fabulous example of her work here. Look at this fabulous painting by Nita Spilhaus of Table Bay. Nita Spilhaus was born in Lisbon, in Portugal. She came to South Africa in 1907. An important date because it was shortly after the arrival of Pieter Wenning. Pieter Wenning arrived in Pretoria in 1906. He would later move to the Cape in 1917 and shortly after his arrival exhibit with Nita Spilhaus in Cape Town. As I said, this is a view of Table Bay, the iconic sort of Cape Pines in the foreground, and in the background the bay sort of opening up. I love the colors in this work, generally quite muted, quite thinly painted in areas, a very gentle turquoise wash for the water, and then the buildings sort of much further down from the artist's viewpoint. Look at the lavenders and greys and purples amongst the building. It's almost as if a sort of dense mist or purple cloud has settled amongst the city here. I absolutely love that effect. Also, the wonderful silhouette in the top left section of the painting. A relatively small jewel-like picture. You'll see her very famous monogram in the bottom left, the N encircled. This is a completely different example by Nita Spilhaus. We're still in the Cape, but this is a far brighter picture. It shows a wash day in the Boerkaap area. There's lots of activity in the foreground. You'll see the women sort of walking amongst the laundry, these sort of rickety lines all around them. Chickens sort of scrambling around again in the foreground, sort of described with these just little flashes of brown and red. You'll notice, of course, the dominating compositional element in the center, this wonderful sky-reaching minaret with this fabulous green teal roof. It contrasts beautifully in front of the lavenders and mauves in the mountain behind. I also love this wall section in the left-hand corner, painted in these creamy mustards and this lovely terracotta roof too. Such a bustling, colourful picture by Nita Spilhaus. Of course, one can't talk about romantic realism or gentle impressionism in the South African context without Hugo Naudé, arguably the forefather of that style of painting, particularly in the Cape. This a very typical painting, a landscape, mountainscape view of which he painted many. You'll notice the style, of course, these shorter brushstrokes, influenced heavily by the Barbizon school. Hugo Naudé was in France at the turn of the century. He was entirely influenced by that mode of painting, as well as the Impressionists. He comes back to the Cape in 1902 and thereafter builds a very successful career painting these kind of tranquil Cape landscapes. Looking at this particular work, the things that catch my eye are the wonderful deep crevices in this mountain facade, painted in actually quite strange, atypical colors. You're looking here at peaches, purples, very, very dark grays, as well as other blues, whites, and pinks. But it gives a really fabulous, shimmering view of this very hot, hazy Cape landscape. Robert Goodman was born in Taplow in England in 1871. He came to the Cape with his father in 1886. Now that's a hugely important date. First of all, it was the year in which Johannesburg was established. It was also the year in which Henk Pierneef was born in Pretoria. Gwelo launched his career in 1895. He spent a lot of time training and exhibiting in France as well as in Britain. In 1901, he famously changed his name to Robert Gwelo Goodman. He thought the African element might help him more make a name for himself on the London scene. Anyway, he did spend some time during the Anglo-Boer War as a war artist. And in 1903, he paints a magic picture like this, which is, of course, not a South African picture. After the war ended in 1902, when artists like Frans Oorde went up the east coast of Africa, Gwelo Goodman went to India. And this work shows, of course, the floating palace at Udaipur. It's a kind of picture you wouldn't necessarily expect from a painter best known for his Cape and KwaZulu-Natal scenes. It is a remarkably beautiful picture. Look at the foreground, of course, these wonderful speckles of pink and green, blue and purple depicting these flowers that are being picked by these women in these sort of fabulous robes and saris, sort of winding themselves or winding through these wild flower beds. The floating palace, of course, dominates the middle section of the picture, and it has a wonderful reflection in the water. When one stands in front of a picture like this, one realizes just how spectacular and dazzling a painter Gwelo Goodman was. This work shows the Boshoff Gates in Newlands. I love the foreground and these bare branches up at the top of the picture. With all these little dashes and dots of colours, you really get a sense that the ground and the trees are on fire. Such is the fabulous movement on the canvas surface. A work like this also has huge historical significance. This is an 18th century gate and painted obviously before Gwelo Goodman died in 1939. Now interestingly, these gates were renovated by the City Council of Cape Town in 1940, so a few months after Gwelo died. So they would have been captured by Gwelo in their more original state than how they stand today. So historical significance too in a picture like this. I think Gwelo would have been quite offended had he been described as an impressionist. He always saw himself as a realist, at best a romantic realist painter. But I think to our eye today, a work like this falls squarely into a gently impressionist mode. I absolutely love this picture. I love the contrast of these oranges and corals and limes and greens with these very, very rich blues, a wintry kind of Cape blue of the sky in the background. This picture is by Terence McCaw. I honestly believe he is one of our most dramatically overlooked painters. His body of work in the mid-20th century is actually quite spectacular as well as being historically important. He was a war artist, an official war artist during the Second World War, and as I say, the pictures he produced are remarkable. He was born in 1913 in Pilgrim's Rest in the then Transvaal. He studied at Wits Tech between 1930 and 1933 under Emily Fern as well as Sidney Carter, two other very underappreciated artists. And this work is a very early example. It dates from 1936. In fact, it must be one of the earliest examples I can think of. It would have been painted shortly after he finished at Wits Tech. I think when I first saw it, I just assumed it was a Cape seascape or beach scene. Of course, that's what he became famous for, and particularly around Kalk Bay. But this is, in fact, Donegal in Northern Ireland. It's a special painting in so many ways. Chantel, I think, earlier mentioned the great painter Sorolla, and I think if you look at these wonderful speckly blues, almost like the side of a dorado or a trout in the water, you get a sense of how dazzling an artist he was. He could really work paint in the most beautiful way. So you have this huge interest, this shimmering element in the sea, a more turquoise shadow under that sailing boat, but in the background the landscape itself is painted in far more creamier greens and limes. Really, really impressive work, I think, which set the tone for a very, very important career that followed. Gregoire Boonzaier is, of course, one of the giants of 20th century South African painting. He was enormously prolific and hugely influential across probably 3 generations of painters. He was born in Newlands in the July of 1909 into a very artistic family. His father, of course, was the important satirist D.C. Boonzaier, but his father always had important artist friends around. Artists like Pieter Wenning, Nita Spilhaus, Moses Kotler. And it was, in fact, Moses Kotler who gave a young Gregoire at 14 years old his first box of oil paints. And that would be the beginning of a, as I say, remarkably prolific career. We have sold works by Gregoire painted across 8 decades, which is really quite staggering. He was enormously talented as a young artist. In fact, there's a quote on the wall just off camera from Pieter Wenning talking about Gregoire's work, where he says, "Mark my words, he's going to surpass us all." This is probably my favorite example in this collection, a work from 1956, and it is of course a traditional still life, but you'll notice, I'd like to think, the very clear influence of Paul Cézanne. These cubist elements, if you look at the way the tablecloth is constructed in these quite sort of solidified planes and simplified geometric forms. I love the way that Gregoire is just channeling one of his great mentors and inspirations, Paul Cézanne. I also love how muted a work this is. It's not trying to be flashy with any eye-catching or crazy colours. And in fact, the closer you look at it, the more you realise how thinly painted some of the elements are. This was, of course, a technique that Cézanne used himself, where he would put almost as much emphasis on the painted elements as the areas left in blank canvas. This is a South African Cézanne, and just goes to show what a quality painter Gregoire was.